Hello, dear friends. I hope you're doing well. Our discussion today concerns the literature review or the review of the literature chapter, which is the object of complaint by a number of students at the level of the doctorate, the master's, the BA, and whatever other level. Writing a literature review on the face of it seems to be a burdensome task. However, if we follow the necessary steps that we are supposed to follow, then the process becomes very easy. Let me serve notice at the very beginning that when you are under pressure because there is a deadline, for example, or because you believe that you are busy elsewhere and then you do not have enough time, you have not had enough time to write a literature review chapter, or for that matter, any other chapter, and then you reserve 1 or 2 weeks to do that, then you are lying to yourself. What you will produce is a chapter that lacks in the characteristics of a good chapter. Therefore, you have to bear in mind that you really need to take the necessary amount of time, regardless of how competent you are, regardless of how knowledgeable you are of the field of investigation. So that's point one. Point two, any task, be it in research or elsewhere, has to be broken into manageable chunks, into building blocks. When you do that, then you will be successful. It's not the burden that breaks your back, but rather it's the way you carry it. So we have to know how to carry this burden. So that's point one. The review of literature chapter is the part of your dissertation that constitutes a bridge between the core of your study, that is to say, what you state in your methodology, your analysis, your discussion, your findings, and everything that you report later on as a finding, and your starting point, which are your objectives and your research problem, research gap, and so forth. I talked about these things in a former video. The literature review has to have as a main function laying the groundwork for the reader in order for him or her to get a grasp of the main theme of the work. Well, I'm not going to say that it does not presuppose any knowledge. Just with zero knowledge about the topic, it's highly unlikely that the reader will go through the theoretical framework in a very comfortable way. Yes, so some knowledge is presupposed, but it is the task of the thesis writer to make the chapter to the point and to make it as simple as possible. Try to simplify. Complicating life for the reader is very easy. So the challenge in academic writing is to simplify, is to proceed in a logical order, in a logical way, and to try to introduce concepts such that the reader will feel that there is a smooth transition as you move from one point into another. In this, there is a part that some researchers would call a theoretical framework. And the difference between the review of literature and the theoretical framework is that in the theoretical framework, which is self-explanatory anyhow, what we do is introduce the theoretical foundations of the study. The theoretical foundation, that is to say, the theory that you are espousing in your work. Let's take the example of a researcher doing syntax, for example. If it is couched within the minimalist program, for example, then this part called theoretical framework may expose information about how generativism started and the way in which its spectacular ascendancy in the field of linguistics influenced researchers around the globe and the implications it has for second language acquisition for other fields. And then you provide a historical sketch of the development of this theory until you are, you reach the point where you provide very detailed discussion, very detailed description of the minimalist program, which is the theoretical repository of your thesis. This is, of course, to familiarize the otherwise unfamiliar reader or the less familiar reader with the concepts and how they developed over time. So part of it can be a historical sketch, but the lion's share should go to the description of the framework, to a detailed description of the framework you are adopting. If this theoretical framework is lengthy, for example, if it's a 60-page 60-page part, then it's better to make of it an independent, autonomous chapter and then move to the other part, which is the review of literature, and make of it another chapter. You can lump the two into one chapter if you feel that the number of pages is fewer. Then you can lump them together, produce between 40 and 50 pages, and you can call it a chapter. There is a very important point that I would like to make here, and this is something I have gleaned from my experience with a number of students writing their theses at different levels. The review of literature chapter is not a part where the researcher synthesizes information from previous studies and stacks them in that part so that they look neat, and that's not the review of literature. A review in the literature has to be necessarily critical. Critical means what? Means that the writer, the identity of the writer has to be shown there. You are an insider now, you are not an outsider. An outsider is someone who says, so and so said this, so and so said that. No. As a thesis writer, you have to be the tailor. You have to make connections. You have to actively, if there is any synthesis, it should be an active synthesis. You have to take part in the discussion. How can you do that? By critiquing. Critiquing means referring to, the strong points and referring to the maybe the weaknesses and how this author, for example, replied to that author, or how this author managed to overcome the pitfalls of his or her predecessor, and so forth. So you can do this by comparison, by your own reaction, your own reflections, etc. But try to avoid stacking information as they are from this article, from this book, and then call it a review of the literature. There is another problem that is widespread among researchers, among thesis writers. It's when they produce a review of the literature chapter, they finalize it with the documentation, with everything, and then they forget about it. They move to the methodology chapter, and then to the analysis, the interpretation, and the review of literature disappears, is swept from view, is not given any other importance. That's a mistake. Why? Because when you have your findings, when you run your statistical analysis or qualitative analysis and come up with your own conclusions, you need to discuss them. And when you discuss them, you need to do so in light of the existing theoretical, in the existing literature. How can you do that? It's by referring to your review of literature chapter. Note, please, that every now and then, that's a tip for you to make your study more coherent and more logical, more coherent. Every now and then you need to open a bracket and cross-refer the sections. For example, in the review of literature, you can open a bracket and say, see discussion in chapter so and so. Of course, you don't know about the results while you write the review theoretically, but the review can be revisited even after your results have been presented. And of course, in the discussion part, you can make reference to the review of the literature by saying, for example, the first finding of this study is that phenomenon X is influenced by phenomenon Y. And then you try to find an explanation, and then you open a bracket and you cross-refer and you bring the reader back to the review of the literature part. The worst that can happen in a thesis is to have this feeling that when you take a chapter from the thesis without affecting its unity, it means that the chapter is useless. So try to make your chapters useful by cross-referencing. The last piece of advice, and this is not just for the review of literature part, this is for every single thing, every single idea you express in your thesis. Whatever new idea that is not so commonsensical needs to be documented. With this, we bring this discussion to a close, and I wish you all the best.